Good morning. I'm going to be the third and last person to welcome you to Boulder to this and this special conference on classroom assessment. The theme of this year's conference is assessment as a learning experience. And as I think you can readily agree if you've scanned through the program, the conference itself is shaping up to be a first-rate learning experience in its own right. On behalf of myself and the conference organizers, we are really thrilled at this tremendous turnout. I want to take a moment to acknowledge and thank some of the people and organizations that have made this event possible. First of all, we're grateful to the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation and the Gordon and Betty Moore Foundation for their sponsorship of this conference. Their generous support has made it possible for us to achieve our vision of a conference that creates a much-needed space for dialogue between education practitioners, policymakers, and researchers around implementing principled approaches to the development and use of classroom assessment for teaching and learning. We also thank Dean Schultz and the CU's Boulder School of Education for sponsoring last night's welcoming reception, where the food was surprisingly excellent. And we also thank the Center for Assessment for donating to the Scholarship Fund for educators to attend this conference. The big picture planning around the conference theme and keynote speakers was done in collaboration with both the Center for Assessment and our local partners, Aurora Public Schools, Cherry Creek School District, the Colorado Department of Education, and Denver Public Schools. Finally, I want to acknowledge the leadership and hard work of three individuals in particular. The first is Lorrie Shepard. Lorrie had a vision for this conference, and she really put her heart and soul into helping us realize it. The second is Kim Cho. No conference is possible without someone like Kim, who has worked for so many months to attend to every imaginable logistical detail, keep everything on track. She is the one who is sending you all those emails. You get a chance to see her, thank her for all the hard work she's been doing. And the third is Elena Diaz-Balello. Elena just makes things happen, period. And she does it with mind-boggling efficiency. She's recently recovered from an ACL tear that might slow her down on the ski slopes in the coming winter. But in the meantime, while the weather is still warm, I have a suggestion for a new outdoor activity for her, walking on water. Let's give all three of them a big hand. Okay, I have two last announcements before we get to the main event. First, I want to take a minute to give a quick orientation to the second floor, where all breakout sessions will take place. The Aspen room is directly across from the ballroom entrance, that way. The West ballroom is on the other side of this wall to the right. And rooms 235, 245, and 247 are out the doors and to the right as well. So everything should be on the second floor. I think there was a typo somewhere in the conference that suggested one session on the fourth floor. That's wrong. Everything's on the second floor. So if you have any confusions, please ask and we'll happy to direct you. And this is the second floor. Thank you, Lorrie. She's still organizing, is exactly right. So the second thing is, if you didn't sign up to attend a roundtable or poster session between 5 and 6:30 this evening, you can still join us. There's no sign up necessary. But please remember to bring your name tag and ID so you can grab a drink and an appetizer and join a rich conversation at a table or a poster. Everyone should know that we had more submissions for paper sessions this year than ever before. So we created the roundtable and poster sessions to provide better access to the top-notch work that was being proposed. It should be a great opportunity to learn and socialize. And just so you know, we have a registration that was 280 people this year. I think that's the most we've ever had for this conference, and it's very exciting for all of us. Okay, so with all that said, let's get to the main event. It's my great pleasure this morning and honor to be able to introduce this morning's keynote address featuring Deborah Ball and Lorrie Shepard. Deborah Ball is the William H. Payne Collegiate Professor of Education at the University of Michigan and Director of Teaching Works. Dr. Ball studies the practice of teaching as the active work of building relationships with children to support their learning. To this end, she uses elementary mathematics as a critical context for investigating the challenges of helping children develop agency and understanding, and of leveraging the power of teaching to disrupt racism, marginalization, and inequity. Her current work centers on ways to improve the quality of beginning teaching. Lorrie Shepard is the University Distinguished Professor in the School of Education at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's most well known for her research into the use and misuse of tests in educational settings and her contributions to test validity theory. Her research studies on test use have addressed the identification of learning disabilities, readiness screening for kindergarten, grade retention, teacher testing, and the effects of high-stakes accountability testing. Her recent work is focused on the integration of learning theory with classroom formative assessment. Now, if you've ever had the privilege to share the room with these two incredible women, then you immediately understand why both were elected president of the American Educational Research Association, both were beloved during long and successful stints as deans of their respective institutions, and both continue to serve as fellows of the National Academy of Education. When they speak, you find yourself hanging on every word. And with that in mind, what a luxury we have in store for the next hour. It's my great pleasure to introduce our first keynote speaker, which will be Deborah Ball. Deborah is unable to be here in person. Her father has recently been in ill health. She's traveled to Iowa to take him home from the hospital. That's why she can't be here in the flesh. However, the wonders of modern technology, we're still able to have her join us through video, and she'll still have the opportunity to interact as part of questions and answer after she and Lorrie have a chance to give their presentations. So let me start and turn the floor over to Deborah Ball.
Good morning. Yes? Good morning, everyone. I'm sorry that I can't be here with you in person. I hope you can hear me all right. As Derek said, unfortunately, I'm here helping my parents cope with a serious illness, but I'm grateful to all the people at the University of Colorado Boulder, as well as the organizers who are already thanked to making it possible for me to still kind of join you this morning. I think what I most regret is that especially given what Dean Schultz said, the range of people who are at this conference who will be taking up such an important set of questions means that this is going to be a remarkable opportunity to learn, to interact, and to grow together. And that's a piece of it I can't do nearly so well remotely, and I regret that. But I do appreciate having the opportunity to at least participate in the first part of this conference this morning. So when Lorrie and I discussed this first keynote, what we agreed was that I would take on a first part of our question, which is, whenever we talk about assessment, it's critical that we be thinking about what is it that we even want to be doing with young people, and how might that then be aligned with what we would care about assessing, as well as how we might go about assessing it. So there are technical questions, there are moral questions, there are practical questions, but all of it has to rest on a foundation of what is it that we're actually trying to do with young people in classrooms. So I entitled my portion of the keynote, Teaching Ambitiously. What does this mean, and what does it take? I decided that the best way to start would actually be to watch a small glimpse of classroom teaching and use that to talk to one another a bit about what we see when we watch classroom teaching and what it is that might lead us to call something teaching ambitiously. And then we'll extract from that some principles about what we're even talking about when we say things like that about teaching and learning in classrooms. So just to frame what I'm going to show you, I'd like to begin by showing you might be kind of a simple math problem that the children in the video have been working on. It isn't actually simple if you're these children, because at the level that they are in upper elementary school, and with the advent of the Common Core having changed a lot about the way we introduce and teach fractions, this idea is not all that simple for children as they first encounter it. The idea basically is that fractions are numbers, and fractions live on the number line along with the numbers that are already familiar to children, 0, 1, 2, and the like. Children have had lots of experience with fractions even before they enter school, but they principally have experience with fractions as parts of wholes, in the sense of fractions of pizzas or fractions of pans of cake, or objects in the real world, but they don't frequently understand or come to appreciate the sense in which fractions are just other numbers and they live on the number line. So this problem that asks, what number does the orange arrow point to, and explain how you figured it out, is far from simple. Maybe just take a moment, whether or not you've ever taught elementary school math, and imagine for yourself what might be things that children might think about this question if they aren't familiar with the idea that fractions live on the number line. Clearly, the answer is supposed to be 1/3, but what are other reasonable answers that children might come up with as they make sense of this diagram as they first encounter the idea of numbers on the line? Just take a moment to think. How many different things can you think of that children might imagine the answer to be? Well, probably you thought of things like maybe 1/4, because you can see 4 little lines, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. You might think 2/4. You might have thought, well, some children might think it's 1 because they're pretty used to thinking of 1 as coming after 0. And you may have had other ideas as well. Many children might think it's 1/2 because for lots of children, 1/2 is kind of a universal fraction that lives between 0 and 1. And you may well have thought of other things as well. But we're going to watch a small clip of videotape from a classroom in which, after the children have had a chance to think about the question by themselves and they've talked with a partner, we're going to watch the very beginning of the classroom discussion. And remember that our goal here is to be thinking together about what do we mean when we say things like teaching ambitiously or learning ambitiously? What are we talking about? So I'd like you to try to watch for what do you notice that you think characterizes what you see. This video is extremely short. What we'll be watching is right after the teacher has made a bid to the class, brought them back to whole group, she said something like, who'd be willing to come to the board and show us what you came up with for this question? Your answer doesn't have to be right because this is something we're just beginning to work on, but who'd be willing to come up and show us what you came up with and explain your reasoning? So we're going to watch a girl named Anaya come to the board and explain what she came up with. So watch closely.
Listen closely and see what you think about her reasoning and her answer.
I put 1/7 because there's, did she say 1/7? Yeah. Because there's 7 equal parts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Before you agree or disagree, I want you to ask questions if there's something you don't understand about what she did. No agreeing and disagreeing, just all you can do right now is ask Anaya questions. Who has a question for her?
Okay, so what I'd like you to do now is think for a moment about what you noticed about the work of teaching ambitiously. Whatever it is that you noticed that you might characterize as teaching ambitiously, push yourself a bit to name what you noticed. Interestingly, I didn't show you the teacher, but there's still a great deal for you to think about what teaching ambitiously might encompass. So take a moment, talk to the person next to you. I'm going to give you about 30 seconds to do this. So turn to someone near you and see what sorts of things you each noticed. All right, why don't we come back together? And unfortunately, since I can't be there in the room and elicit from you some of the things you thought about, I'll name some things that I've heard other people comment on, and maybe some of them will intersect with things that you also noticed. One thing that, especially for those of you who have thought a lot about this whole question of the number line, you might have noticed that students are working on a complex and powerful mathematical idea, because although it may seem rather mundane to you, it underlies the foundations of a great deal of mathematics to understand principles of the line. The line is a really powerful environment for understanding number, and they're working on the beginnings of that. Another thing you might have noticed is something about the task itself. That task was designed to confront that key mathematical idea in the sense that the number line is purposely drawn to go past 2. And if the task had been drawn, for example, to just go from 0 to 1, it would have been a completely different task. So what Anaya has produced by saying 1/7 grows directly out of the task's design that's set up to confront the question of what do we mean by the whole on the number line. When we're talking about fractions that are sets, the whole could be anything. It could be 3 pizzas, it could be 4 pans of brownies, it could be 12 people. But on the number line, the whole is always defined as 0 to 1, and that's a new idea, and the task is designed to bring that out. You might notice that students' thinking is centered, because all we actually hear so far is Anaya's thinking and a girl asking under her breath, did she say 1/7? The bit that the teacher has made to ask the student to share something about their thinking and their reasoning might suggest to us that students are being encouraged to share provisional thinking. It's not that answers don't matter ever, but that along the way to developing thinking, one ventures ideas, conjectures, tries out questions, and that's being clearly valued here. You might also notice that, particularly because the teacher isn't even visible, that students are oriented to work collectively and to listen to and speak with one another. The fact that the girl whom you may have overheard saying, did she just say 1/7? Gives us a bit of evidence that students are used to thinking that when another student is presenting at the board, the question is, what is that student saying and how does that compare to the thinking that I've done? You might also begin to get a sense that the discourse norms in this particular classroom focus on understanding other people's ideas and arguments, since the beginning of the discussion starts with the presentation of a student idea. And there probably are some other things you noticed, like you might have noticed some things about who came to the board, what answer was presented first. There are a number of things here. For example, you might have seen a classroom where all of that would be true, but the teacher would have elicited the 1/3 correct, so-called correct answer first. And here you can see there's a deliberate action to bring up an answer that provokes the question of what's the whole. So if I step back from this for a moment and think what might be meant by teaching ambitiously, it might be useful for us to think, what are the foundations of this? And this is kind of take one on this because we're going to revisit it in a moment. So one thing from the work that we've been doing at the University of Michigan and other parts of the country, it's crucial to understand and appreciate and value the work of teaching. And for that, we've been involved, many of us, in trying to name what we call high leverage teaching practices. I just want to give a few examples of them, but what I really mean by this is practices that teachers are using all the time in subtle and nuanced ways that are adapted to their students in context, but that don't come along for free. The average person on the street doesn't do these things just naturally. They take skill, they take experience, they take adaptability, they take attunement to one's students. And they include such things that we saw in this case, like eliciting and interpreting student thinking, leading a group discussion, like how do you open a group discussion and how do you set it up so students are interested in and looking at one another's ideas? Establishing and supporting classroom norms for discourse, and you can see these other ones here, including things like building relationships. What did Anaya need to feel supported and safe when her teacher invited her to come to the board? And what did the teacher need to know about Anaya or about other children in the class in order to connect with them to build up what will ensue from this beginning of this discussion? But that's not all it would take to teach ambitiously. There's also a great deal of underlying theory, and particularly sociocultural theory, that I'm sure Lorrie will talk more about. But in particular, for what we've just seen, it involves understanding that learning is social and not just individual. In fact, it's highly interactive, and that it's deeply intertwined with issues of identity and practices of all different kinds, including those of the discipline, those that have to do with culture. There are many different kinds of practices, and that also orients the work of teaching ambitiously. And finally, it would be remiss not to mention that understanding content in a way that allows you to teach it is crucial to teaching ambitiously. So we all know fractions, but understanding something about what makes that question crucial in that task is an example of knowing something that's not what, again, the average adult who knows what fractions are would understand how to do. Now, I want to caution you at this point in my talk to say that we've said a bunch of things here about teaching ambitiously, but there's a glaring omission that is crucial to add, and that is that when we think about classrooms that are rich and discourse and discussion, we often think about how crucial they are for empowering young people. But I want to call to our attention very directly today that classrooms that are rich in discourse and discussion are, in fact, empowering, but they're also incredibly high risk for reproducing patterns of racism and marginalization that permeate our entire society. Why is that? Well, it's because the habits that we absorb for who's valued, what's considered smart, whom we turn to, how we position children, how we read children, how we interpret them, what we try to do, how we understand the environments, how we talk about the resources that they have, whether we think of them as having deficits or strengths. All of these grow out of a much larger set of patterns in our society. And so the more open we make our classrooms, ironically, the more chance there is for those patterns that reproduce marginalization and oppression to seep right inside of our classrooms. And I refer to those in my own work as the discretionary spaces we have in teaching that allow us to draw on all kinds of things from our larger experience, our histories, and our society, many of which are important in teaching, but they're also spaces in which patterns that are oppressive seep right into the classroom practice. So I'd like to go on a little further and think about what that means. What I'm claiming here is that teaching ambitiously requires more than we've so far discussed. And I want to take a little more look at a tiny bit more of the video that we looked at already. So we're going to hear Anaya give her answer again, and we're going to go just a little bit further. And I'd like you to be thinking as you watch, given that I said there are patterns that can seep inside our classroom, I'd like you to think, what are the risks in this episode, and for whom are they risks? So what's likely to happen next when I stop the video? What does that reflect about normative patterns that can be oppressive in classrooms? Use your experience in classrooms to think about what you think would happen next and what that suggests about what risks
Listen
are.
closely and see what you think about her reasoning and her answer.
I put 1/7 because there's Yeah. Because there's 7 equal parts, like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
Before you agree or disagree, I want you to ask questions if there's something you don't understand about what she did. No agreeing and disagreeing, just all you can do right now is ask Anaya questions. Who has a question for her? Okay, Tony, what's your question for her?
What?
Go ahead, it's your turn.
Why did you pick 1-7?
Okay, so what's important here is we're seeing a little bit more of what we've already discussed, that there are norms for children to be talking to one another. The classroom is based on children's thinking, and several of the other things that I already mentioned earlier. But if you ask yourself what's likely to happen next, either to Anaya or to Tony, drawing on your experience of what you've seen lots and lots of times in schools, it may reveal a bit of what I'm talking about when I say there are risks here as well. So I want to think about what's likely to happen next and what would any of these likely moves do. So take a moment and just think, what might be said to Anaya next? Just sort of habitual things that happen all the time in classrooms. And what do you think might be said to Tony? Take 30 seconds and just see, not necessarily what you would do, but what do you think might be said to either of them as a tool for understanding the risks? So I'm going to offer a couple of examples, and what I'm going to show are a couple of things that happen very regularly in classrooms, and I'm going to make a couple of comments about what the outcome is of these pretty normalized moves that we see a lot. So basically, common things that could be said and what the outcome would be. So one thing that might be said to Anaya when she shows her answer of 1/7, a teacher might say, can someone help Anaya out and show what we call the hole on the number line? It's a very typical kind of response when a student is at the board and has said something that the teacher sees as somehow not complete yet or not quite right. But if you think about the outcome of that, as benign as it may seem, Anaya's answer is thereby signaled as incorrect once you say that. And she's positioned as not really having completely contributed to the class's work. In fact, her key contribution to the class's work isn't really being used, which is her explanation, her carefulness in looking at the intervals on the number line, her very detailed way of showing how she shows the equal parts on the line. These are all difficult ideas, and those are all crucial to the student's work. And yet by going on to say who can help her out, all of that gets laid on the side. Now, as far as Tony, one of the many things that might be said to Tony is something like, Tony, you know, when you're ready to participate appropriately by not playing with your hair and laughing and have a real question to ask, I'll come back to you. Pretty common, actually. And what's the consequence of that? She's really publicly excluded from the discussion, and her mathematical contributions also sidelined. She's actually asking the key question, where did you come up with 1/7? And if you know additionally that Tony has 1/3 on her paper, you might jump to the conclusion that she's somehow trying to put Anaya on the spot. But if you review for yourself how careful Anaya's explanation is, Tony may very well be wondering now, wait a minute, that sounds pretty plausible. I'd like to hear that again. Whatever it is, we don't know for sure what Tony's doing, but the habit that would lead to Tony being rebuked is a habit that is an example of what I mean by patterns. And we know these very well from the patterns and the results for the disproportionate ways in which Black girls are read in classrooms and the disproportionate ways in which those readings by teachers are handled. Now, even for beyond Tony and Anaya, if either of these things is what happens next or any number of other things, the other students in the class also see two Black girls positioned in different ways as not contributing and as troublemakers. This also is a consequence for their learning. So these very common responses have rather big weight, and they are the examples among many of what I mean by patterns of racism and oppression easily seep in to classrooms that are open for classroom discourse and discussion. And that means it takes deliberateness on our part to think about what teaching ambitiously means to take account of and deal with those. So I want to think again then, what does it mean to teach ambitiously in this episode I've been sharing with you? And I'm going to show you the last little bit of video to see what it is that does happen. I want you to keep thinking, what does it mean to teach ambitiously?
Hey, Tony, what's your question for her?
What did,
Go ahead, it's your turn.
why did you pick 1-7?
Let's listen to her answer now. That was a very good question. Can you show us again how you figured out why you decided 1-7?
Okay, so let's talk about that alternative. I'm going to call this countering those patterns, the patterns of sort of habitual responses to students, and particularly in this case to 2 Black girls, and think about what this very simple different move achieves and what the outcome is. So the first is that Tony's question is being acknowledged publicly. Her answer, which you can see here on the screen, is 1/3, but she doesn't really have much of an explanation. So her question is a really important one. And the outcome then is that instead of being rebuked or sidelined, she's trusted as being serious, she's seen, and she's recognized for her contribution. She asks a very precise mathematical question, and she's doing this thing that's pretty hard, which is to ask Anaya a question instead of disagreeing with her. But Anaya too, so what happens to Anaya? The teacher turns to her in a serious tone and says, Anaya, that's a good question. Tony asked you a good question. Can you explain that again? So the outcome for her is that her explanation is the focus of attention, and it's positioned as important and that she's contributing to the class's work. I already mentioned her explanation is very well structured, and she uses vocabulary and language that are crucial for the class progress. So in these 2 moves, the 2 children are treated differently, and their contributions to the class become part of the class's work, as well as what the other members of the class see about these 2 very different Black girls and their positioning in class. So I want to ask this question again. What do you now additionally notice about the work of teaching ambitiously? These are some of the things that I mentioned after our first viewing, but I want to add a few more now that tie together what we were just been talking about. One is that in teaching ambitiously, it's crucial that students are positioned as competent. And that in the case in particular of mathematics, and there are versions of this in other school subjects, that what it really means to be smart in mathematics, or who gets to be smart, is being actively redefined. A third is that the children and their identities, their Black girlhoodness, their ways of being in the world are taken seriously, and they're treated with respect, as opposed to viewing them with suspicion or interpreting them as behind, struggling, or acting out. And to put the point on it, oppressive patterns of control and behavior management that permeate our schools and for which we have really damning data are being disrupted by not doing those same things that typically happen. So what does it mean to teach ambitiously in this case? We still can keep our basic principle, which is students' thinking is the center here. Their thinking, their contributions to their classmates' learning are the centerpiece. So what does it take to teach ambitiously in this case? One part is seeing Anaya's explanation and Tony's question as key to the class's work. It also involves seeing Tony as asking a mathematical question that she actually means. That takes a couple of resources. To deal with the issue of the girls' questions and explanations, you have to know some math. And to interpret Tony as you do, you have to actually start with first principles that you assume that Black girls, in the words of Macy Golson and Danny Martin and several others, that Black children are brilliant, and that you don't start with an assumption that they're struggling behind or misbehaving. But these 2 things that I've named here are just beliefs and knowledge and orientations. You also, if you want to disrupt these patterns in order to teach ambitiously, have to have other things to do than saying things like, who can help Anaya out, or thumbs up, thumbs down, or when you have a real question, I'll come back to you. You have to have other things to do as a teacher in order to teach ambitiously. So what were the outcomes of this just small different move? Well, 17 minutes later, at the end of this class discussion, Tony was the one who went to the board with another girl and modeled how to produce a complete explanation of how to name a fraction on the number line. And in her exit ticket, which you can see here as an example of a kind of formative assessment, she's able to give an answer for a more complex fraction and give a more developed explanation. Anaya, too, has moved from not completely grasping yet that the whole is always from 0 to 1. And in her exit ticket, you can see her also answering a more complex question and giving quite a complete answer, including saying there are 5 equal parts and there were spaces, so it's 2/5, and because the whole is from 0 to 1, this is the key idea. But additionally, Anaya writes in her notebook something that helps us see something else important about her sense of identity. She feels confident and accomplished. She writes, I did well on my goal today because my goal was to share my ideas with the class. And I did. I went up to the board and shared my ideas with the class on fractions. But again, it's more than just these 2 girls. Teaching ambitiously has consequences for everyone. The other children developed a depth of understanding of fractions on the numbers. And in all of the exit tickets, about all but 2 children were able to answer them with complete explanations and much more clarity than they had before the lesson, when only 4 of them were able to identify the answer 1/3 on the entering problem. And they all also saw something they don't regularly see in classrooms because of these patterns. They saw Black girls as leading the work of the class, positioned as competent. So stepping back to where I started, teaching ambitiously, what are the goals we have? Well, certainly a goal is to help students develop and use complex ideas. Another is to support the development of strong academic identities. But a third that is crucial to include is to use the power of teaching to disrupt patterns of racism and marginalization that invisibly and visibly permeate classroom practice. And that is also an important facet of teaching ambitiously. And finally, through those first 3, teaching ambitiously helps to advance for all children the skills and dispositions for developing a just and democratic society. Teaching has more power to do that than almost anything else in our society. So what are the foundations for teaching ambitiously? Let's just review that from our first round of this. I mentioned high leverage teaching practices and sociocultural theory. I mentioned knowing and using content for teaching. But let's now also add this last point. The foundations for teaching ambitiously are to use the power that teaching has to disrupt historical and systemic patterns of racism and oppression through the very small moves that we make all the time in the discretionary spaces of our work. I'd like to close with a handoff to my dear colleague, Lorrie Shepard, by asking this question. Given all of this, how can we better align our palettes of assessment practices and tools with these practices and goals of teaching ambitiously? And keeping in mind that the purpose of all of this is to act in the interest of children's flourishing and the development of a more just world. Thank you so much.
I want to add my thanks to Deborah, who will stay with us and be a part of question and answers if I do my part nearly half as well as she did hers. She's to get to the university campus and be able to interact with us is wonderful, and we're very grateful to Deborah for doing so. I also want to add my welcome. It is really awesome that you all up and down the Front Range and from distant school districts as well as measurement colleagues around the country managed to be here today. So I'm going to be talking about coherence. So it's my job now to sort of live up to what Deborah has outlined for us. In particular, how could we think about classroom assessment coherently engaged with ambitious teaching practices? So my outline is first to talk about coherence. Why is that important to this particular endeavor? Why as the basis for coherence, learning theory, and particularly sociocultural learning theory. What do I and Deborah mean by ambitious teaching? I'll say just a little bit more about that, though I think we can live very well with what she has helped to elaborate. And lastly, what do these ideas mean for formative and summative assessment practices in classrooms? I'm talking about how these things manifest in classrooms. So why coherence? I forced myself to make a slide about it. I wanted just to say, duh. because when things are incoherent, and I made a long list, and then I thought, no, these are the two big ideas. It doesn't make sense, so neither teachers nor students can understand the disparate parts, and especially for novices, coherence makes things almost impossible because you're asking them to make enough sense to piece it together. And that's very confusing. And more often, what we have to admit is that things are actually at cross purposes. So having an underlying theory, I'm going beyond Randy Bennett's theory of action and going to cite a couple of others. I want to acknowledge Bill Penuel in the room because we've talked about within your theory of action, like if I give this assessment, this is going to happen, you have to have a deeper understanding, which is what is your understanding of what supports learning and how will that guide what we're trying to do. So my first sort of reverent reference in a measurement-y audience is to knowing what students know, now 2 decades old. And this is Jim Pellegrino, Naomi Jadowski, and Bob Glazer's very important work. This was the National Research Council taking what had been outlined in How People Learn 1 and saying what it meant for assessment. And in that volume, still available for free on the National Academy of Press website, they elaborated on the idea of vertical coherence, which meant from the classroom to the State House. When they were writing this, interim assessments didn't exist. So they were talking classroom and large scale. And then horizontal coherence, which meant among curriculum, instruction, and assessment, there has to be just this integral connectedness to support sense-making. And such coherence, and let's focus on the horizontal, requires, I said both, and that's when there were 2. We're talking about 3, that these share the same underlying model of learning. That means that they share the same conception of how developing competence in a discipline unfolds. First I know this, then I'm able next to understand this, I'm able to use this knowledge. What does it look like as I become more competent in a particular area of inquiry? To elaborate on the idea of vertical coherence first, with large scale, I'm going to quarrel with my dear colleague Joan Herman's rendition of what that vertical coherence looks like. And I call her out and include this example because it was used as the version of vertical coherence that was used in a subsequent National Research Council publication in 2012. I'll cite later, you'll see what I'm talking about. That this idea is that we want to build and align from how I assess daily, weekly, and units of instruction in classroom. Those are sort of the yellowish bars. And then growing out from that, what I assess quarterly, annually, and ultimately over a career, K-12 career. And the objection I want to make to this is that what this has done, when it is the case that our large-scale assessments aren't up to the job, we import from the large scale into the classroom less than we want, worse than we want. And so this picture, and even there's a little hushing. I'm looking at Scott Marion and trying not to say anything bad. There's some question about whether we want to talk about balanced assessment systems because they do this. So I want to make this problematic for you to think about. And then ultimately, in the course of this talk, try to offer an alternative vision for classroom assessment, and then go back and make nice with Scott and say, and then what could districts and states do if they understood that vision? But it's not this. And in my objection, I'm not rejecting the idea that you would share standards at the State House and in the classroom. But the vision of learning and the understanding of instruction that supports the learning you aim for cannot be shaped by that external test. And that's a really important thing for us to understand. So I'm used to giving rants. I narrowed it down to just one slide. So kind of the last word before we go on to what we're really up to. But let's acknowledge these basic criticisms of what happens when we have high stakes tests and the pressures that distort instruction. So those first two bullets are very familiar. When we are not up to fully representing the learning goals, we get these kinds of distortions. And especially in low-performing schools, we get a misdirection of effort and kids having to practice more reading and math of a type that imitates the tests instead of anything rich and exciting that would make them want to learn. Less often are these other two bullets that I think are just as important. And that is sort of the psychological and emotional consequences, where children come to believe that the purpose of learning is to perform well on tests. This is what someone like Jean Lave has written about, the commodification of learning, and that they may internalize, to Deborah's example, that they are not capable learners. And teachers perceive that low-performing students are deficient. And last year at this conference, I talked more about the evidence from some of our colleagues on the effect of data-driven decision-making, which is when that's done in a high-stakes environment and teachers are asked to talk about the data, they do some blaming in many qualitative studies of what those well-intentioned professional learning communities are set out to do, but it does the opposite. So we have a lot of work to do to preclude that kind of effect. And I think recentering what we want to do in classrooms is part of what's so important. So here is one of the references when Bill Penuel and I wrote for the Handbook of Research on Teaching, where we made the argument that effective formative assessment should be based on a theory of learning, and how well we can do it is based on the adequacy of that theory. And by adequacy, we included several criteria where we can examine the value of the learning goals. Are they ambitious substantively? And also, do they have the processes of thinking and reasoning that are part of what we truly value? Is there sufficient evidence of what it means to make progress toward those goals? This is starting to hint a little bit at the language of learning progressions, if not formally constructed, informally understood. Also, though, the attention to identity as well as cognitive goals. Who's in the room and who are they becoming because of our practices? And then built in are consequences for equity. So one of the things I hope you come away with this morning is that we should not have a separate office of equity, a separate agenda to accomplish equity. We should be in the midst of how we design curriculum and instruction, be thinking about what it means for equity. And that's why the example that Deborah presented is so critical. Going further, this is just a little kind of say what you mean slide. This is from the last January's 2018 volume of Education Measurement Issues in Practice, where Bill Penuel and Jim Pellegrino and I talked a little bit more about sociocultural theory and elaborated on what knowing what students know was talking about, because they use models of learning and theories of learning, and they mean different things in different sort of sections in the volume. And so a simple way to think about this is that they're talking about big theories, where they talked about really the old individual differences, behaviorism, cognitive theory of learning, and they didn't say sociocultural, they said this closely related situative theories of learning. And then they also talk about like what it means to develop competence, and they are starting to talk in the learning progressions language of much smaller units of let's make progress on understanding density, or let's make progress on understanding photosynthesis. And those are tiny things. It helps if you call the tiny things models of learning and the big things theories, but nobody follows that distinction. And so you just have to kind of go with it and think that we are making, when Deborah and I talk about sociocultural theory, we're talking about a big theory that attends to how it is that who I am is part of learning as I participate. And it's not just the cognitive processes in my head, it's the cultural surround in the classroom, and it is also what I bring from my past experiences at home and in community that are all working when I'm trying to make sense of something new that I'm trying to learn. So that's a little vocabulary there. So I hope that explains why learning theory as the basis for coherence. And then let's do a couple slides on why sociocultural theory. Because this is a claim. You could have a theory of learning and it could just be cognitive theory. Few people stand up these days and say they want to do behavioral learning theory, but they do it. They just don't confess. So sociocultural learning theory has the strongest empirical and theoretical warrant, we say, because it best accounts for the social nature of learning. Virtually every major scientific document now says, of course learning is social. Of course you don't go in a cubbyhole and learn it all by yourself, unmediated by tools, by language, by what's important to your cultural surround. So of course it is cultural, and more thoroughly, the theory more thoroughly integrates motivation and identity development with cognitive aspects of learning. And there's a wonderful piece written like 30 years ago. So this is like this isn't brand new. Lauren wrote something about where she traced what it was like to be a psychologist 50 years ago and 40 years ago, where you went and learned motivation over there and cognition over here. There's still motivational psychologists who don't know about this stuff. But in the learning sciences and thankfully in major reports like in the National Academy of Sciences consensus reports, this integration of motivation and cognition, the seamlessness of them, you can't sort them out, and that's critically important. And as I've already said, sociocultural theory attends to equity. It does so in the patterns of how we interact, if you use it as your lens, and I think you saw that in Deborah's example, and it's in its foundational understandings of how learning occurs, attends to not just knowledge from context, but the interests and experiences of students' daily lives. That has to be part of how we engage any new learning, or we're really not letting people be who they are when they come to the classroom. I thought that this little historical thing that I just tried to paste together might be helpful. And this is like from 1950s, which is sort of when people say Noam Chomsky and the cognitive revolution occurred. And it's very interesting if you think like a psychologist, is that cognitivists just rejected behaviorism. But I would not say that the exact same thing is true from how cognitive psychology and sociocultural theory relate. And it has been more of an evolution because nearly everyone in the field, to some extent, acknowledges that learning is social. But if you watch the progression over now 70 years, what that means to say that learning is social, socially influenced, no. It is socially embedded. And I would say that that's what our work is, to try to fully understand what we mean by that. And that's the left to right progression in this picture. And over to the right then, we have kind of how we think now, which is not just social context, but sociocultural practices. It's why now everybody takes it for granted that you wouldn't just have content standards in mathematics or in science or in literacy, but that you would also have practices. So this is now a widely shared understanding, even if people don't specifically say, oh, I'm a socioculturalist. That's where it comes from. This idea that practices are integral to how we come to know. And then from that theoretical understanding comes things like asset-based pedagogies instead of deficit-oriented ways of interacting in classrooms, and culturally responsive teaching more generally. Deborah used the word adaptive teaching. That's what we now understand. So we have some shared theoretical understandings, and I'm just trying to call them out a little bit. So before I show you my proposed alternative for a model of how these things could be integrated, I wanted to cite one more authoritative source, and this is the more recent National Research Council reference that Jim Pellegrino led for the Academy, where they were asked by, I think by Congress actually, to say, what's the research on deep learning and 21st century skills? So, we were just past the turn of the century when that was commissioned and published in 2012. And they also argued strongly for this interaction among cognition, interpersonal and intrapersonal. And their charge was to list out research on each of the kinds of skills. So what you see here is, what do we mean by intrapersonal? And what do we mean by the interpersonal? Many of these skills of which we try to build in when we think about curriculum. This is really important. It makes me crazy when I watch districts invest in mindset interventions entirely separate from teaching and learning. In fact, I'll show you some examples later, they may even have quite negative practices for mindset, juxtaposed with, on Fridays, though, we can work on our mindsets. So it's really important that the interrelatedness of these things be taken very seriously. So here's my idea, evolving. So this was like a second version, where I try to think about classrooms. This has nothing to do with external high-stakes tests. This is a picture of a classroom culture. It has a left-right orientation to it, so think about progress over a year. And the fine print, can you read at the bottom, goes from students' prior experience from home, community, and school, an entwined learning progression. Those three stacked circles were from the 2012 report, NRC report that I just referenced, and I want to see them at work And that's why Oshigo is here. I should thank her for making this picture because I couldn't do the weaving of those things together. I made them bigger to the right because they grow. I pasted grading on top of the cognitive part only because it would be a mistake to grade kids on their interpersonal and between person and within person characteristics. We can just barely do assessment of cognitive things when we're at our best in ways that doesn't do harm. So let's think about that. A picture to honor collaborative learning, but to the main point of this talk and to this session, and why I asked Deborah to join us, besides the fact that she was the top listed of all the partners' requests, is to show ambitious teaching and formative assessment practices, top and bottom, influencing that moving forward entwined. We should be thinking about the practices that help us do these things. They are ambitious teaching practices, and formative assessment practices are entwined with those. They are sometimes the same. I'll show you an example in a minute, but an example is eliciting student thinking, right? What is that? Is that a ambitious teaching practice, or is that a formative assessment practice? Well, it's both. And so we could so embed formative assessment in how we move this entwined learning progression forward that you wouldn't be able to say, oh, that's assessment and that's instruction. And a really good question for all of us is, when should assessment be marked for students, and when should it be invisible to students? And how should that be different for kindergartners versus sixth graders? And these are really important questions for how we understand doing ambitious teaching. So from a sociocultural perspective, ambitious teaching attends to who students are and who they are becoming, while providing access to challenging curriculum. Some people think ambitious teaching is just challenging curriculum. Not so. And classroom interaction patterns that allow students to collaborate and build on each other's ideas. And there are lists of what these things look like. And let's just issue another reminder, which is that list is not a checklist. They should not be done this one or that one mechanistically. The whole point of the theoretical understanding has to be part of what we're trying to do, or it really defeats the purpose. So those things have to be part of the theory. I'm citing here my colleagues who, Mark Winchell, Jessica Thompson, and Melissa Broughton, who's on our faculty here. This is just one example. You can Google ambitious teaching and you will get lots of interacting things. Some people make it exactly synonymous with deep learning and 21st century skills. I think we just need to stick with the theoretical understandings, which does support deep learning, and worry about how that gets transacted. So here's an effort that I made to try to say some more things about the kinds of practices that are shared and which ones might be unique. So shared understandings of ambitious learning goals and what the criteria are for ultimately judging. Those are both an ambitious teaching practice and a formative assessment practice, all of these grounded in sociocultural theory. Eliciting students thinking I mentioned before. The kinds of discourse disciplinary practices are the occasion for observation and formative assessment, but that tends to be an instructional practice, whereas improvement-focused feedback, how can I get better at this, not what is my grade, is part of formative assessment practices, that these things should just be completely integrated one with the other. Sociocultural teaching and assessment attend to the social nature of learning. Sociocultural approaches more explicitly account for diversity and allow for different entry points and pathways to shared understanding. So that middle bullet that's Dewey, right? Keep your eye on the horizon, but attend to who the kids are individually and how we can all then jointly make progress. And the last bullet is Calabresi-Barton's probably best exemplifies, but there are quite a number of researchers that are doing this kind of work where it's part of teaching to mediate what my meanings from the street or community or church mean in terms of the disciplinary practices that I'm trying to learn as part of the classroom culture. Sociocultural formative assessment includes tasks, practices that should provide qualitative insights. And here's where I'm struggling with my measurement colleagues. I don't know if we need your talents, because every time you try to quantify things, you ruin it. Now, that doesn't mean I don't appreciate for program evaluation at the district level that I don't need some uniformity, even some standardization, and some quantification. But I am very worried about the measurement-y stuff coming into classrooms. Formative assessments occur in the midst of instruction and should not be graded. Dylan William is on another continent, or he would be here today helping us summarizing all the research that reminds us that if you grade things, students pay attention to the grade, they don't pay attention to your comments, and they don't learn from it. The only way they learn from it is if you have a practice where your comments are about moving their learning forward. And a productive classroom assessment context does not focus on points. So another enemy is infinite campus and requirements that districts post twice a week to keep parents informed, because the format implies quantification. It also implies that learning is finished, and so now I've got it entered in the gradebook. And it actually undermines doing anything like what we're actually trying to talk about here. So a couple slides on grading. I do want to finish up shortly so we can have a couple of questions and answers. But remember, the reason we shared those principles in advance of the conference was we want this conversation to go on throughout the 2.5 days of the conference. So in addition to designing for what we value, we also need to be aware of where we're conducting this work and what are the impediments. And it's really important to be clear about how grading practices undermine the learning supports that we're talking about. In particular, if tests diverge from valued learning goals, that's where attention and effort are directed. The use of grades as rewards and punishments is still a motivational theory that's at work in schools. And little things like, I shouldn't be talking, Sue Brookhart is here. You can get the whole literature on what's right and what's wrong about grading practices. But for sure, using grades to control students is when they least want to participate in learning. These are grading practices that emphasize learning, which includes focusing on the achievement and the goals and the representations of what we want kids to be able to accomplish that matter. Achievement-based grades is language in that literature that makes this transformation. And a thing for us to decide, different by age level, is how much the formative assessment is visible as grading ever, or is an approximation to what will eventually kids will be judged on, let's say if they have to take in middle school a department level exam. So those relationships have to be worked out. There are many practices that help address parents' need for A's and kids' worries, but you have to realize how the grades are subverting things, and so I suggest having contracts with your parents about, sure, we aren't for extra credit points, we are for second occasions for being able to master the work that we value. Couple more bullets about grading practices that support formative assessment. They have to be truly about learning. They have to possibly use peer and student self-assessment to get feedback. They have to help keep students focused on the substance of how to improve. And for feedback to help learning, there have to be opportunities to use the learning again. So that's another sort of practice, which is kids think they're doing the work to be done. They have to help keep students focused on the substance of how to improve. And for feedback to help learning, there have to be opportunities to use the learning again. So that's another sort of practice, which is kids think they're doing the work to be done. And when they put it in that box and they're done, then we aren't communicating how we're going to use that in subsequent classroom endeavors. Just one slide. This is from last year's talk, so I won't elaborate, but this is to say that data walls in classroom are a pernicious example of shaming. Lots of research, randomized experiments done in the 80s. Again, we need Dylan William here to say that when you compare kids normatively, implicitly or explicitly, they know that they are not a capable learner. So if we understand positioning in classroom and the kinds of things that Deborah was talking about, we have to take down these walls. Okay, 2 more slides. Back to this picture. I want to acknowledge the research and evaluation doctoral students who told me last week that this was all very nice, but it wasn't very practical. I have 2 slides about, well, what could make it practical, and then we'll have a couple minutes for question and answers. So one thing you have to realize is how much money is going to the bad things. So to the data systems and to the professional training to learn how to read dashboards, and all of that is money that could be redirected toward a different vision. So I do think that it's worth thinking how much of this is built in a way that we would have to disrupt it and think differently to be able to enact the vision that I and my colleagues are proposing. And I also want to be very practical. No one is suggesting that you go install this in 12 grades, all the subjects, next week. But if you wanted to own a vision like this, I do think, since coherence is part of the message, if you had in your district office literacy people who deeply understood this and wanted to work with their diversity and their assessment colleagues in a way that better entwined and tried to use this kind of a vision, it will be your own, this kind of a vision to outline their professional development instead of having each of those sources of professional development being done separately. You should do that, and you should do it in 3rd grade. No one is saying install the whole thing, build the whole thing. But it is important to think about how could we do some of these things? What part of it could we take on and learn from? So that was, I felt like I had to come up with an answer since those doc students said it wasn't possible. Okay, so we know a lot about teacher learning, and that is also obviously fundamental to anything like this vision being enacted. Effective professional development helps teachers understand how students learn specific content. That doesn't have to be deeply tested out learning progressions. It could just be bringing student work and ordering it. And one thing that David Webb and I did in a class was ask each student to bring in breakthrough experiences. When did you see that students were stuck with an idea that you thought was fundamental, and what happened? What happened to move that forward? So there are lots of ways to have these kinds of conversations. Effective professional development supports teachers to try out new knowledge in context of their own practice and talk with their colleagues and gain additional support from subject matter experts, perhaps. It's part of reform efforts that bring these things together, not separately. I emphasized that before. And it's collaborative, it's collegial, it's not top-down in terms of supporting teacher learning. These are from the principles that were shared with you in advance, and I've just taken the district ones because Bill Penuel, Jim Pellegrino, and I have argued that because of local control of curriculum, districts are really the best place for this kind of work to be taken up and enacted. I want to say a thing about the principles document. I made a mistake when I labeled the file and I said NCME on the file. That's just where I was keeping it, my mistake, because these are not NCME developed and endorsed principles. They are intended to be a draft, and you're all invited to provide feedback. The principles are intended to be a draft of something we want to put out from this conference, and it'll be available on the CADRE website. CADRE is the center that Derek runs. So these principles at the district level would suggest that you try to implement the kind of curricular coherent activity systems that have been described, this horizontal coherence among curriculum, instruction, and assessment, that you build collaborations across staffs and departments in your school district, you coordinate and integrate the professional development so that teachers don't have to make the connections themselves, but it's happening in the PD. Develop district assessments that embody learning goals. These will probably not be all or even some multiple choice type tasks. You'll establish grading policies that avoid grades as motivators. Examine what Infinite Campus is doing to your relationships and what it makes teachers turn out, sometimes twice a week, the rules are to post. All for parent surveillance instead of kids learning. And change your school improvement practices and including your teacher evaluation practices. Shout out to Doug Watkins because the idea is, could you examine sociocultural practices as a way of supporting these kinds of transformative changes? Thank you. So we have 8 minutes, no, now 7 minutes. So we're going to have like time for 2 questions. But before that, I want to ask if Deborah has any follow-up comments, and then maybe we'll take just 1 question. And you have exactly a 15-minute break?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to keep everybody on schedule.
Deb had to leave.
Pardon?
So Deb had to leave, so we're
I'm sorry, Deb is offline, so now we have time for 2 questions.
Hi, thank you, Lorrie. I really liked what you said about, learning theory, because I think, thinking about the measurement profession, the way we train people, we don't teach enough about learning theory. We don't teach enough about instruction. So these are things we don't know. And I think the work on the classroom assessment principles is really exciting too. Of course, I have to respond to what you said about we don't need you. And I would like to think that we don't need traditional ways of thinking about how to quantify work in the classroom and so forth. But the we don't need you, I don't like the us versus them kind of implication of that, because we are assessment, right? We are educational assessment. This is an assessment conference, and NCME is here, and if I think about what classroom assessment is trying to do, things like construct representation, analysis of response processes, consequences of testing, these are all things that still apply. And I think, for most of my career, a very small part of it has been on norm reference tests. And I think, to support education, we are really talking more criterion reference interpretation. So I'd like us to, yes, point fingers at some of the bad practices, and yes, we can criticize organizations like NCME for waiting too long, for being blind to a lot of this for too long. But I think we're at the point where the path forward is to work together. So I think when we think about those measurement folks, I think it includes everyone in this room. And I think we should start, working together like that to embrace these important points you're making.
Thank you, Steve. I agree. I had to wrestle with the idea of whether we wanted to put in a bid to host this conference. So you heard my big worries. One of the problems is with my big worries is that not every person is as thoughtful as all the measurement people in this room. So some things I've written about are historically what tests and measurement courses have looked like in teacher education programs, for example. So I made the point earlier, which is that you have to know what you're fighting against, not just what you're building toward, or you will fall into, lapse into the same problems. But we agreed to host this conference. We agreed to try to have this conversation because I think that the psychometric expertise is important when departmental exams are made. They are important when districts decide that they want to track. Instead of purchasing a product off the shelf, they want to build something that will help them help teachers have good representation of goals. This field created performance assessments in response to the last generation's lament and complaints about testing. So there's great strength and talent here, but I think we have to acknowledge what we're up against and then have some attention and safeguards for those things. One more question. Oh, Scott wants last word.
I just want to see if you're in favor of unbalanced assessment systems. But seriously, we acknowledged as well that districts are the right locus of control for assessment systems, but some of the work we're trying to do is to not pretend that the state assessment doesn't exist, because it does exist, and it can have these pernicious effects. So we're trying to build this coherence. So I think that we're not that far apart on this. And so, but I make clear, you're not advocating for ignoring the stuff that's happening outside the classroom, because it does have effects on the classroom, no matter how tight you draw that bubble. right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, it does. And so that's why it has to be part of your design. I think you have to actively work against having the state assessment dictate things. It is not productive professional development to have just a sort of lovely kumbaya experience in a professional development setting, only wonderful. And then I'm going to go back to my classroom by myself and do this mediation work. Like how much time? And so there are other things that people can do. You can have sample units. Scott and I have both written about replacement units, for example, that acknowledge the place of the test within real learning, right? You'd literally have to take that on. So when I ask you this on the test, and here I'm channeling Linda McNeil's work a million years ago, if the test outside is aversive, then you have to help kids translate. This is what the test will look like. This is what we do in the classroom. They're not so disparate that they don't have a relationship. So just as I said earlier, sociocultural theory would have us doing this crosswalk, this translation work for kids. Here's how this is what you already understand is like this more official scientific understanding. Similarly, the simplified state version of what we're trying to do can be related to what's going on in classrooms. Okay. I'm going to dismiss us. I'm going to ask us for good behavior. I know that the whole reason of coming to these things is to have conversations with your colleagues, but remember, these breakout sessions are golden, so please be on time to the next session. Oh yes, Derek forgot to tell you, all of those of you for whom altitude is a new experience, you need to drink a lot of water. If you're having a headache at all, blood sugar, keep your blood sugar up. So eating M&Ms or
We have snacks.
it's really important. It'll happen to a few of you, not to others. Okay.
I have a couple quick announcements. One, we had a couple questions about Twitter. I don't know a lot about Twitter, but our hashtag is hashtag NCME Boulder, so please tweet at us, about us. And another thing is we've gotten a couple of questions about posting materials online for people to be able to access. If you're a presenter and you would like to have that be publicly available, I can add it to the website, so please just find me.
Thank you. One more thing. Sorry, we got the mic, so we have to talk. Derek said this, but we had so many submissions today for this conference that I really need you all to turn out. We scheduled it to end in time for you still to go out to dinner, but we want to see you at the poster sessions and roundtables, because in any other world, but for so many submissions, the papers that are featured in those roundtables and poster sessions would have been in the breakout sessions. We just weren't sure. We didn't want to divide up the audience by having 10 concurrent sessions. So that's on us, but we need you to help us honor the people in those sessions this afternoon. And let's end by thanking Kim, this is her, for her work. Okay.